very good afternoon to colleagues around the region, colleagues from Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, and of course ourselves, Indonesia. Together, we represent BSEA, Britain in Southeast Asia. And a very good morning if you've joined us from among our stakeholder network in the UK. We're very pleased that you've been able to come into this, which is the first of a series of BSEA webinars following the reinvigoration of our group after 2 or 2.5 years of more or less dormancy during the pandemic period. Some of our colleagues around the region actually had the pleasure of meeting our guest speaker, HMA John Lambe, when we had our first BSEA conference in person after a few years here in Jakarta. And it served as a sort of an hors d'oeuvre in terms of things that can be discussed with regards to the development of ASEAN. As far as Indonesia is concerned, of course, the relevance of us here hosting this, not least just because we are part of our confederation of BSEA, but also because the baton has been passed over to Indonesia in the course of the last 2 or 3 weeks, and Indonesia will chair the ASEAN over the course of the next year. Together with HMA John Lambe, who is the first dedicated UK ambassador to ASEAN, this session will look at the growth prospects for trade and investment in ASEAN, especially with the world reopening post-pandemic. The session will present an opportunity to debate exactly what the British private sector active in ASEAN can expect from the region's further integration. Before I pass over the baton this time to Ian Betts, who will moderate, I'd also like to personally welcome my chairman, Donny, who's joining us remotely, virtually from Singapore. Thank you, Donny. And at the same time, thank our event partner, Rolls-Royce, our venue partner, where we're positioned this afternoon, which is PT Bank HSBC in Indonesia. With that, we trust that this first BSEA offering in a new webinar series, this reinvigoration of our group, will prove to be a great investment in your time. Thank you for joining us. Ian.
Thank you very much, Chris, and welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar. To kick things off, recent events emphasize the growing importance of ASEAN for British trade. These include the recently concluded ASEAN Summit in Phnom Penh, with Cambodia the chair for this year, and the East Asia Summit, which saw guests attending from major trading nations around the world. These recent events, however, are built on years of painstaking work and development in the region. Today's session will explore the future of trade and investment in ASEAN at a time when significant shifts have taken place, following the G20 and APEC summits in Bali and Bangkok, respectively, which also influenced the growing significance of ASEAN and mark it out as a very significant trading bloc in the world. Who better to help us understand these developments than HMA John Lambe for ASEAN and the chair of BritCham Indonesia, Vice Chair ASEAN and President Commissioner for Indonesia for Standard Chartered Bank, Mr. Rino Donosepoetro. We'd like to start off with an initial question to you, John. As I mentioned, Cambodia is this year's chair for ASEAN. They hosted the recent ASEAN Summit in Phnom Penh, and leading members of the government there commented on the fact that ASEAN did not wish to choose sides. It wished to work closely with both the US and China. Now, we're all aware of the geopolitical shifts, risks, and threats that are impacting us now. But considering the pressures on trade, are such harmonious relations possible? And if not, how do you see things developing in terms of an outcome? And what is the role of the UK in Southeast Asia post-Brexit? John?
Great. Well, look, thanks so much, Ian, and thanks mainly to Chris and to Britcham for inviting me back. It's great to be here with HSBC. Great to join you all virtually, and a pleasure to be I didn't realise I was your first seminar webinar guest, so that's an honour and a privilege. So thanks, Ian, for the question. I think so. For me, I think one of the ways that ASEAN has been so successful over the last 50 years as it's existed is the way that it has kind of knitted together the Southeast Asia region. And by working together, it has ensured that this region has a lot of centrality, is what ASEAN talks about, but it's made sure that it's got a really strong role. That, at the moment, as you said, there is increasing competition, but I think ASEAN is such a big bloc in trade terms and economic terms, and it works so closely together that it gives ASEAN a lot of power in that competition. I think also the fact that ASEAN has these strong partnerships works really well in its favour. And the UK, we're still very pleased about the fact we became ASEAN's newest dialogue partner last summer. And I think that phrase, calling us a dialogue partner, really says a lot about how ASEAN approaches the world. It thinks that by having partners, by engaging in dialogue with them, that it can protect its own interests and bring those partners together as well. You asked a bit about the UK role in the region. And it probably won't surprise you that we see it as an absolutely crucial part of the world. With this audience, I'll particularly focus on the economic prospects, but this region is really one of the engines for global economic growth at the moment. I think it's really striking that despite the global challenges at the moment, ASEAN is expecting to grow by 5% this year. That's a really fast rebound from the pandemic. Of course, people were hoping it would be even more, but in the global context, I think that's really very impressive. And from a UK perspective, we're really pleased that UK ASEAN to increase further, and a really big part of my role and the team's role is to support businesses and work with governments in the region to deliver exactly that.
Thanks for that, John. There's also an element there of how ASEAN is going to be approaching China in terms of that relationship. It's a key one. China is a major trading partner for the ASEAN bloc. How do you see that panning out in your role over the next couple of years?
So China is an absolutely key partner for this region. I think it's the biggest trading partner for every single ASEAN member state now, and that, of course, has delivered a big part of ASEAN's growth. I think I'll speak a bit from the UK perspective, though. I think we're also seeing sharpening competition and some behaviour which, frankly, is causing some concern in the UK. I won't quote at length, but the UK Prime Minister gave a speech earlier this week where he set out his views on exactly this question. And the phrase that he used to describe the UK approach was robust pragmatism, by which he means that the UK will stand up for its values, which unfortunately we see some divergence with the way that China is approaching some questions on values. We'll stand up very firmly for our own interests, making sure that we're protecting UK resilience, including economic resilience. Again, we see some challenges there, but we also recognise that China is an absolutely indispensable country on a number of big global issues, and we will work together on those because we need to, and it's the responsible thing to do. And I think and hope that, coming back to the original question, that ASEAN would welcome that approach. I think for them, they want to see, I think my impression is they want constructive engagement between their partners, and this region will benefit the most when partners are able to do that, despite our differences.
Thanks very much for that opening response. We'll come back into trade and investment in a little while. We'll take a couple of questions with both you and Pat Donny before we open the floor for some questions, and then we'll reopen for a couple more points for you. But first over to Pat Donny. So John's talked about knitting together the constituent parts of ASEAN. He's talked about sharpening competition from other powers around the region. How do you see that when Indonesia is about to chair ASEAN for next year, Pak Doni, do you anticipate that Indonesia will be able to help the bloc to ensure free trade or freer trade across the bloc? And if so, how will that pan out? What could hinder that progress in the coming year for Indonesia as the chair of ASEAN?
Thank you, Ian. And I think just following what Ambassador John has mentioned, I think if you look at the outlook for next year, I mean, whether you call it, this is the fractured globalization that we're having now, the whole disruption on the supply chain, inflations, geopolitics, and so on. But there's one particular bright spot in the world, and that is ASEAN, indeed. I mean, as a collective overall. So the importance and prominence of ASEAN has really come to light when you talk about trade and investments globally. For any major companies, fund managers, or capital owners of the world. Now, with Indonesia taking over ASEAN, I think there's a few things that we should can be highlighted, pointed out. This is coming right at the back of Indonesia's presidency of the G20, and many have consensus has mentioned that it has been a relative success for Indonesia in sort of achieving the right kind of diplomacy and ensuring that G20 remains the largest sort of economic sort of forum, if you will, in the world with the meeting in Bali. Now, a lot of the topics being discussed at the G20 and B20F have been around sustainability. It's about net zero and green financing, green infrastructure. That we should expect to be a topic for ASEAN as well. And this is the fourth time that Indonesia is going to chair the ASEAN since the last time in 2011, I believe. And if you recall back about 11 years ago, that was the time when Indonesia, under the chairmanship of Indonesia, that the RCEP concept was introduced, which obviously now being put into play earlier this year. So you could see that from that perspective that I think Indonesia will promote ASEAN to be the destination of choice for foreign investments, opening up further the markets in ASEAN. So there's a lot of factors actually that would support that. And indeed, ASEAN as an organization is based on consensus. And over the years, we see that the effectiveness of the way ASEAN proceeds their views and agenda has relied rather significantly on its current chair. With Indonesia as sort of the largest economy in ASEAN, we believe that things will progress further, particularly on the economic side, with the realization of the vision of ASEAN Economic Community by 2025. You're talking about hindrance. I think from an economic perspective, I think ASEAN is also quite diverse. So having that uniformity in terms of taxonomies, regulations, would be something that has to be sort of overcome. And it has been a perennial sort of, I think it's not just us. If you look at EU, I mean, it's a similar thing, right? Actually, that has always been a challenge, if you will, to get that sort of uniformity in terms of policy framework and so on. The other point is, of course, the political side. And this is probably John actually would be best placed to offer a view relating to the Myanmar, to what extent that this will cloud ASEAN as a unity overall and the impact that it has on the progress of the AC.
Thanks, Pak Doni, for that contribution to that question. John, if I can come back to you. Besides ASEAN and G20, which we've recently seen, we also saw the APEC summit in Bangkok, in Thailand. There, member countries gathered to discuss issues of very serious importance for the region, in fact, for the world. It's clear that the Indo-Pacific as a region politically has now become well established. China, How would you define the UK's relationship with China today when current geopolitical factors are taken into account? Could you say that that relationship is determined more by defence or trade factors? And what is Britain's position vis-à-vis the Indo-Pacific concept?
So I think, well, there is this new phrase that, as I mentioned, the Prime Minister has used of robust pragmatism. And I think the way that I would see that is wanting to have a balanced relationship with China. So being clear about where the UK's values lie, being really clear about where the UK's national interests lie, and recognising that in several of those, working with China will be a good way to achieve what we want to achieve. But I think at the same time, unfortunately, being honest with ourselves that some of the things that China is doing are not aligned with our values or not aligned with UK interests. And I think in those cases, not being afraid of saying that and saying it clearly. I think coming to the Indo-Pacific, it is really interesting to see how that phrase has evolved, and as you said, it's now very well established. It's a pleasure always to be on a panel with Pat Donny because I can always just agree with everything that he says. But I think, Pat Donny did a very good job of setting out how Indonesia had set things moving for ASEAN. One of the other things that Indonesia has really played a big role in is something called ASEAN's Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which I think was a very important process which kind of ensured that ASEAN took ownership of that phrase, because I've heard people saying, I think it was in Singapore, they said Singapore is the hyphen in the Indo-Pacific. You have the Indian Ocean washing one side of ASEAN and the Pacific Ocean washing the other side. But for a while, it felt to some ASEAN members that all the people talking about the Indo-Pacific were external partners, and now ASEAN has really clearly taken ownership of that. I mean, I think from a UK perspective, it's a great thing because it's a very ocean-focused way of thinking, and we're a maritime power in the UK. So for me, it really highlights the kinds of maritime links, the similarities that the UK shares with ASEAN, even though we're thousands of miles away. And it reminds me, I learned from Pak Rizal Sukma, who used to be the Indonesian ambassador in London, that Queen Elizabeth I appointed an ambassador to the court of Aceh in the 15th or 16th century. So that's a good kind of reminder that these roots and these connections go back a long, long way, and they're all because of these maritime trade routes that link us together. And despite the passage of history, we're still linked in the same way.
Excellent. You mentioned Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, and robust pragmatism, the phrase that he's been introducing in recent important speeches in Parliament and elsewhere. And he was, of course, here in November for G20, which was a remarkably successful event, not just for Indonesia as the host and Bali as the host location, but also for the British Chamber and British businesses, all played a major role in that success. I'd like to come back to you, Pat Donny, on a particular point of success which has been lauded that emerged from G20, and that concerns climate change, which is a massive impact for us all and a worry for businesses and people around the world. Climate change is a very divisive and vital area for businesses and governments. The JET-P program, Pat Donny, that program was agreed at G20, was introduced as a landmark advance, bringing billions of dollars to the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy and the decarbonisation of the environment. In your view, what's Britain's role in that initiative? And does it go far enough to respond to the threat posed by climate change? You were at G20, you may have witnessed this. What's your perspective on that, Donny?
Thanks, Ian. I think you used the right word. That's it. It's a landmark agreement. That announcement on the JET-P of minimum $20 billion for Indonesia, $10 billion coming from the public sector, and another $10 million at a minimum from the private sector, from GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. I happen to be part of the negotiating team on behalf of GFANZ, and what I can say is that this would signify a landmark agreement where G7, together with G-Friends from the private sector, G7 will bring along together the multilateral development banks, because they are the majority shareholders, to create a master umbrella, a master platform for financing as a catalytic effort to accelerate net zero for many emerging markets. Indonesia is not the first one for JETP. South Africa was earlier in this year. And within ASEAN context, Vietnam is following suit. But this announcement in Bali at the side of the G20, I think would mean that Indonesia, the $20 billion as a minimum is the largest ever. It supersedes South Africa's $8.5 billion. For Indonesia, very specifically, there are three parts that have been included as part of this JETP. First one would be the renewable energy investments. The second one, and this is probably at the heart of it, is the early decommissioning of Indonesia's coal-fired power plant, because the rather sort of specific nature of over capacity on electricity supply in Indonesia at the moment, and the CFPPs of Indonesia is relatively very young. So that will spin out some of the initiatives. It's not just the blended finance on the concessionary loan, grants, and so on, and commercials, but also the carbon credit from avoidance. And I know Coordinating Minister Luhut is going to London now that we have been successful in announcing that commitment altogether. But the point to be made over here is that the private financing of 10 billion, which is 1-to-1 leverage of the public credit, is very small. We shouldn't be happy with that. It should be a whole lot more, maybe 15 times bigger. But of course, all the public sectors, the MDBs and the private sector would have to work in collaborative manner so that leverage can be optimized going forward. But you were asking about the British involvement there. I think G7, the UK is very much part of that. And I know that the UK, His Majesty's government, is leading the negotiation on JETP for Vietnam. For Indonesia, it was agreed that G7 will be led by the US and Japan. But if you look at the private sector, out of the 7 sort of earlier signatory banks who are supporting this, the $10 billion includes the 2 British banks, HSBC and Standard Chartered. And the 2 of us actually have very deep roots in Indonesia and have been playing a very critical role in the success of the JETP program for Indonesia.
Thanks, Madani, for that. As you say, a very significant program there, and one that I'm sure Britain will take a lead in, as well as British businesses. I'd like to be fair to our participants and include some of the questions that have come through, and then we'll come back to both speakers shortly. You did mention Myanmar earlier, and Myanmar is an important member of ASEAN that has not been able to be as active over the last 2 years because of the events that have been going on there. We do have a question from Peter Crowhurst, CEO of the British Chamber of Commerce there. Perhaps, John, I could elicit a comment from you on this. Despite the current sanctioned environment that Myanmar is in, there are still opportunities for UK companies there to make a difference. How do you see, and what is the UK position on trade there? And how can the UK and UK business, British business, be better positioned to support the people of Myanmar? Have you got anything to respond to on that?
Yes. Before I do, if I might just add to what Pak Doni was saying about the JETP, I'm very pleased to say that the UK government has also recently agreed $1 billion of loan guarantees to support the Indonesia JETP. So that's quite, as you were saying, it's a landmark agreement, private public sector combination, and the UK government is, as you hoped, stepping up to play its part. On Myanmar, I mean, the first thing to say is obviously that the situation in Myanmar, unfortunately, continues to get worse. And I think it was quite striking that at the ASEAN summit a few weeks ago in Phnom Penh, where I was at the same time with our trade minister Greg Cairns and several of the people on the call as well, for some great business engagement. But ASEAN leaders, when they met, agreed a further set of decisions on Myanmar, which include in various ways the possibility that actually ASEAN will engage less with Myanmar in some ways, because I think ASEAN members feel that the Myanmar junta has really not delivered on the commitments it made in the 5-point consensus. And in fact, quite the reverse. We've seen that the violence has got worse and the suffering of the people there has got worse. So I think, from that perspective, it's just really important to highlight that the UK is really supportive of ASEAN's approach to this. We're on the Security Council on what the Security Council should do with Myanmar. It's our job to kind of lead that. And so we're working really closely together. I think next year, under Indonesia's chair, this is going to be a big issue. Under Myanmar's constitution, there are meant to be elections next year, and it's very hard to see how they can be carried out in the right way. So I think that's going to be a challenge for ASEAN and for all of us. I think in that context, and coming to the question, I think no one wants to see the people of Myanmar suffer. It is really, I think, clear to ASEAN members, to us, to other partners, that this is a coup that was led by the military, and all the suffering is being caused by the military. So I think it's vital that all of us are working together to make sure that the people in Myanmar are getting the support that they can, and maintaining what economic growth is possible. The challenge, I guess, that Peter would know better than me is, of course, that the business environment there is there are many firms with military links, and so ensuring that companies avoid sanctions, I think, is really important and necessary.
Very good, thanks. And we may be able to take more questions on that in due course. But I'd like to return to Pat John, if I may, just to build on B20 in particular. Over the last 2 weeks, 2 weeks ago at B20, Chief Investment Minister Luhut claimed at that forum that the current government has brought major achievements to Indonesia that make the country very different from what it was 8 years ago, and that Indonesia's macroeconomic indicators are now among the best in G20. What can British business do, in your view, to take advantage of that and build on this in the future? Andoni.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I think that's a very relevant question. And that has been asked by many of our counterparts, particularly from the UK side. I think if you look at Indonesia, again, we paint that picture about ASEAN overall, over 5% GDP growth. Indonesia itself is the largest economy. The outlook seems to be pretty stable, despite what's been happening in the rest of the world right now. And it's the whole entire sort of value chain of nickel all the way to lithium batteries and EVs, as an example, is one of the big draws. So many investors have come in and invested into that. But if you look at it from a British perspective, British businesses perspective, there's a number of areas or sectors that can be really very attractive in Indonesia. One is that sustainability and green investments, if you will. And that spans across infrastructure, in renewable energy, technologies, and others as well. That JETP program will trickle down fast enough to provide that kind of financing, and will accelerate the development and the pipeline projects that will be needed to ensure that Indonesia accelerate its net zero commitments. So that's one. The second part is the construction and infrastructure. Indonesia is a developing country. You can see based here in that there's a number of significant strategic projects, whether that's on value-added sort of processing in the value chain of manufacturing and industries, whether that's on infrastructure such as the new capital, or even on urban transport, as the UK government, along with UKEF, along with the UK financial institutions, have been supporting the Jakarta MRT for phase 3 and phase 4. That's an example. More cities will be needing that public transport going forward. Then you got consumer products. We got a number of already established and one of the longest operating UK companies in the consumer goods, Unilever with PZ Cousins, and a number of others. Then pharma and healthcare, that is one area that we believe that the UK companies can really help and provide opportunities for investments here. Now, the new digital economy, that's another part. We have seen Indonesia has the largest number of unicorns across ASEAN. It's really with the young population, rather untapped, if you will. That makes a very robust market for any digital economy, and it's growing rapidly. Last but not least would be the service sectors, and that's one area that the UK companies are really world class on, whether that's on consultancy, on accounting, legal, financial services, insurance companies, and so on. So that's really the areas I can think of actually that can be very attractive and will be growing significantly in Indonesia.
Thanks, Tony. And I think British companies and members of BritCham across the region are particularly well represented among the sectors that you've highlighted there and stand to benefit and contribute to the ongoing development that we expect to see in ASEAN, not only during next year, where Indonesia will chair, but onward. Before I come back to you with a more specific question, Tony, I'd like to ask John, we can't ignore the fact that beyond ASEAN and beyond Southeast Asia, there are unfolding events around the world which are very concerning. At the ASEAN summit last week, Ukraine signed a treaty of amity and cooperation in Southeast Asia with the bloc in Phnom Penh, committing to peaceful coexistence and friendly cooperation among states in the region. Now, after 9 months of war in Ukraine, how do you see that conflict panning out among all of the impacts that we've seen across the region? Supply chain disruption, inflation, etc., and possibly for the future, what are the prospects for an eventual return to the peaceful community of nations for Russia, and what will that look like?
Well, big questions there, Ian. The first point is I think it's great news that Ukraine signed ASEAN's Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. I think that is a strong demonstration of ASEAN taking an interest. I think ASEAN feels that it has prospered because of the peace and stability that this region has experienced over the last 30 years or more. And that has delivered prosperity. And I think that is a very strong lesson from ASEAN's experience that they are understandably keen to share. And I think for that reason, ASEAN members share the shock that we all felt when Russia invaded Ukraine, because that felt like a throwback to a different world that was, taking all of those lessons that we've learned the hard way and throwing them out the window, basically. So I think for me, there are two big lessons to draw from that. So one is about the kind of geopolitics of it. To think that a larger country with a bigger military could invade its neighbor for no reason whatsoever and get away with it, I think for me sends a shiver down my spine, and I think would make a lot of countries around the world feel very worried. And that's why we have international law, it's why we have the United Nations, the Security Council, these other things to stop that from happening. We've seen the terrible consequences when it does. So I think from that perspective, that is a lesson that applies all around the world. It applies in this region as well. And so I think it's absolutely vital that we, the UK is playing a leading role. All of us need to make sure we stand up for international law. Ukraine is clearly the victim here, and we need to stand alongside them and help them to defend their territory. And I think, countries in ASEAN see that, and I think feel it, as we've seen in their responses. I think the other big implication is economic. We've talked about ASEAN's own bright economic prospects, and that's fantastic. But equally, we've seen just how interconnected the world is. We've seen the kind of economic shockwaves that have followed the invasion. We saw the impact on food prices, on energy prices, on fertilizer price and availability. Now, most of those things were not the result of of sanctions. They were just because of economic and supply chain disruption, but the ripples were felt here just as much as they were in Europe. And so I think there are big lessons that we need to draw there. I think it's good to see that the prices of many of those things have stabilised, but it's, at least in the UK, and I think in ASEAN too, people are looking at resilience, they're looking at diversifying supply chains, making sure that you're not overly dependent on one region or one country. And that's not just because of war or politics. I can't remember what year it was, but I remember one year the floods in Thailand caused big disruptions in the electronics industry because the nature of the flooding affected these key factories. And I think there are some big benefits there for ASEAN. So ASEAN is a manufacturing powerhouse, and as countries look for more diverse and resilient supply chains, a number of ASEAN member states are benefiting from that. The final question about Russia, the conditions for Russia to return to the family of nations, I think is a big one. I think the behaviour from the Russian government over the past year has put them into almost a unique category at the moment. I can't think of a time when a permanent member of the Security Council has so egregiously breached international law, and I think there is quite a road back for them. But of course, we all hope that we can reach that at some point when the conditions allow.
Thanks for that, John. Excellent response and very helpful in helping us really frame this discussion and how it impacts on ASEAN and the region. We've got a number of countries represented here. We're approaching the last few questions and comments that we can take now. But I would like to come back to that, Don, and ask, Malaysia has been undergoing some political strife in recent times. It now has a new Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim, following several years of political competition, a major corruption scandal, and the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic all playing on it. What's the current state of play regarding British business and the UK in Malaysia? Anything you can say on that in your role in ASEAN with Standard Chartered and in the Chamber family?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I think that's the maybe actually with my hat on actually from Standard Chartered's perspective. But the way we see it is that it has been a positive progress in Malaysia with unity government taking 2/3 of the parliamentary seats led by the new Prime Minister, Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim. It provides the necessary political stability, which is very much needed there. So the market, as you can see, has responded positively with the appointment of the new Prime Minister. The pandemic situation has been under control. Market is opening up in Malaysia. We can see that for the period of January to October this year, the performance of Malaysia's total trade exports and imports remained very sturdy with double-digit growth. And we hope that with the new unity government, this will grow even further. Now, there's a number of sectors that Malaysia has always been leading the way, if you will, in ASEAN. The manufacturing sector had a total sort of approved investment of about 44 billion this year. So that's, as of end of last year. And this is an uptick of about, over 100% than the previous year of 2020. So you can see that a number of capital intensive projects have been agreed and being deployed into Malaysia. This, we hope, actually will restore the growth momentum that aims to accelerate sort of further economic growth with this investments in research-driven innovation and high-value technology industries. You can see that overall Malaysia remains an attractive place to invest, and the local economy actually will be helped by the spur of the FDIs coming into Malaysia.
Thank you for that, Donnie. I'm looking to see if we have any more questions to close in on. I don't see any others in the chat box. So as we're approaching the end of the session, perhaps I could ask John, if you would, just to give us a closing remark on how you see the future of trade and investment. We've spoken about a number of key areas of trade here, including those stemming from the G20 and ASEAN. Anything to conclude on from your perspective in your role, particularly for the next year or two?
Yeah, well, thanks. So I mentioned that alongside the ASEAN summit, we had our trade minister, our returning trade minister, Greg Hands, in Phnom Penh for a meeting with ASEAN's economic ministers. And that was a really fantastic moment. It had been delayed a little bit from September because of the passing of Her Majesty the Queen. And it was a really great moment, among many things, because we agreed a kind of big work plan on our economic cooperation. So that really means we've got a practical framework now for the UK and ASEAN to work together on some of the big shared economic and trade issues that we think are priorities. Now, it's quite broad and wide-ranging, so I'm not going to try and cover absolutely everything that's in there. You'll be pleased to hear that several of the sectors that Pak Donny was talking about as the big opportunities for the region and where there's a particularly good prospect for UK firms are in there. So, you know, across all of it, we'll be looking to make sure that what we're doing from a government perspective, what businesses are doing anyway, in their own right, is really well linked together, and that where we can see a kind of business and government join up, where we could get even bigger impact by working together, we'll be doing that. I thought I might mention a couple of others. As I said, many of the things that Pak Donny mentioned already are on my list, so please take those as read, and then these are additional ones. But a couple of things I wanted to mention quickly that we'll be doing from a UK government perspective. So I think one thing is about looking at how we can bring down barriers to trade. So as Donny said, the region is still quite a diverse region in terms of the economies, and the trading possibilities within the region are still a bit variable. So it's not always quite as smooth and easy as firms might want to trade across the region. And then as everyone on the call will know, individual countries also have some challenges. And the UK, of course, has some challenges too. So I think one of our big priorities over the next couple of years will be working with ASEAN as a regional bloc, as well as with the ASEAN member states individually, to identify where we could lower barriers to trade in either direction, so that we could get even more trade flowing. The other thing I wanted to focus on, where I think there's quite a strong potential role for government, is looking at what we could do together on regulations and regulatory excellence. So it's kind of, I found interesting that in the midterm economic review last year of ASEAN, businesses, both domestic and international businesses, said that regulatory or lack of harmonisation of standards and regulations across the region were a barrier to doing business. So I think one of the things that we're keen to do with ASEAN is think about, you know, are there ways that regulations and standards of different kinds, whether it's product standards or professional standards or qualifications, you know, more harmonisation could allow the bloc to become even more cohesive, and I think that would boost intra-ASEAN trade and investment, and it would also make it easier for international firms either to trade around the region or to come and see the region as a whole, and that would also help ASEAN in its ambition to move up global value chains.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm aware that we're closing very shortly, but one final point for you, and this has come in from the floor from Carl Stanaway, Indonesia. A quick comment on those priority areas. But Donny mentioned several, but perhaps you have another couple.
Yeah. I'll caveat this by saying that my role is to look across the bloc as a whole and not at Indonesia specifically. So I suspect that Pak Donny's list is comprehensive. I know, however, that my colleagues at the British Embassy here are very focused on the potential for green, sustainability across the board, sustainable infrastructure, electric vehicles, renewable energy, all of which Pak Donny mentioned. Big focus on food and drink as well. I'm not sure that Pak Donny mentioned that, but again, a lot that's already there. Potential for even more, but frankly, I mean, the prospects are really wide-ranging. I think that just touches the surface.
Well, I think the list you've just given us is sufficiently comprehensive for the entire bloc. I'd like to thank you and Pak Donny for attending this afternoon and for giving us your responses and comments. We've had a wide-ranging discussion that's taken us through the G20, the B20, ASEAN, the EAS. And many of the key factors impacting and resounding on business around the region and beyond the region. So thank you very much for attending. We have a number of points here that we weren't able to get to. They include the focus on the EV industry, renewable, mining, sustainability, farmer and life science. Those are for another session. So I'd like to say thank you for my part for the opportunity to be with you this afternoon. I'm going to hand back to Chris Wren, Executive Director at Bridgetown, Indonesia.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you very much, Ambassador John Lambe, Donnie joining us in Singapore, and in fact to everybody across our region. Once again, ASEAN, Britain in Southeast Asia, comprises the chambers and business groups of Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, and ourselves, Indonesia. And together, we're working very, very hard to make sure we strengthen the value proposition for our members to provide more opportunity for your businesses to grow and to have connectivity between our countries across this region, which everybody is absolutely uniformly agreed is a region of great potential. Thanks also to our partner, Rolls-Royce, to our venue partner, HSBC Indonesia, and as mentioned, this is the first of a reinvigoration for our group, this particular webinar, and it will be my colleagues around the region who will be taking in turns to host other webinars of a similar topical nature, hopefully on a monthly basis. And I hope that you will give the same support to each of them as you have to us here in Indonesia. It's been our pleasure to host you, and if any of you can get on a plane and get here to Jakarta for December the 9th, we've got a handful of tickets left for our Christmas party. In fact, I'll go one further. You can have a complimentary on me. Goodbye. Thank you.